That really sounds great.
I really felt like Scooby-Doo in that moment.
Teaching developmental science. It was terrible. I look at it online.
And welcome to the Center for Teaching and Learning. I'm so happy that you are here to join us today. I am just so honored and excited to introduce you to our speaker, Jordan Greenfield. If you got to see his presentation last night, it was just amazing. But he's here as part of our Black History Experience programming. And I'm going to let him tell you a little bit more about his background and the work he does. But please feel free to help yourself to any snacks. There's some hot water in the kettle. Make yourself comfortable.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Hey everyone, I'm Jordan. I'm honored and very grateful that I've been invited here to speak to everyone. As she said, I gave this presentation yesterday and it was a little bit more formal, so I'm going to try to keep it a little bit more casual today, a little bit more informal. So if I bounce around on the slides or if I stumble a little bit, just forgive me. But I would like to take a minute to thank and acknowledge all of the kind of participating members and organizations and divisions and programs that took part in putting this together specifically, and these types of events together. It's great to see this kind of thing taking place at public institutions like this, and so I just want to take a minute to say thank you to everyone for that. So my name is Jordan, and I graduated with a degree in architecture from Cal Poly a couple of years ago. And I'm just going to kind of talk about like my background a little bit, and the whole theme of this is kind of arts and Black history. So I'll just talk about kind of my introduction to art and how I have kind of grown and evolved as an artist and a designer and person in the world. So like I said, this is kind of how I had it organized for the presentation yesterday. So I might switch this up a little bit, but just to start with, I'll just tell you a little bit about my background and then my path getting into art and through schooling, and I might brush through my thesis project a little bit if we have time, and then at the end, if anybody has any questions, or I'd like it to be a little bit conversational, so I'll try to just leave gaps in this presentation for questions or comments. So this is young Jordan here, ready to take on the world. Not really any definition of art or artist or anything at this point. I am a biracial man, and I like to kind of start this presentation by acknowledging that this is Black history. And I'm proud of being Black man in the world, and I think it's important to, remain aware of what my family's history is, and also there's a lot of like resistance towards Blackness or anti-Black sentiment in the world. So I just like to start by saying I'm proud of who I am and who I've become and who I'm continuing to be in the world with my family makeup. So. I started going to school young, like everyone does, I guess. We moved around quite a bit growing up. Was born in Reno, and then we moved to Washington State, like Issaquah areas, where I started going to elementary school, middle school, junior high. My mom was putting herself through school, and so we just kind of moved around as she went through school and going to different schools, and just kind of followed her along. And I was never an exceptional student. I was probably like, C student going through all of the grade schools. Moving around quite a bit didn't help that, but I also just didn't, I participated in school as much as my attention span would allow. But So I went through, all of grade school. I graduated high school in South Hill, in Western Washington. And I think I applied for Eastern Washington University. This is the only school I applied to. I didn't really get in. I went to a junior college after that for a few months and decided that school wasn't for me. So I started working, and I worked for quite a long time. I held down a bunch of different jobs. I probably worked 15 different jobs. I got a job working for Costco, and I worked for Costco for a bunch of years, and I transferred from a store in Washington to a store in Atlanta, and I worked at a Costco in Atlanta for a while. And I had been living there for a year with my sister, and she was kind of asking me if I was going to stay permanently, if I wanted to start paying rent or whatever. uh, I wasn't really set on living there long term. I had a friend who I worked with at Costco in Washington who had moved to Australia, and he was working at the Costco in Australia, and he called me. We got on Zoom, or it was Skype, I guess, at that time, but he was like, what do you have going on? You should really come down here and check it out. So I took the opportunity. I got in touch with the warehouse manager in Costco down in Melbourne, Australia. And he was like, yep, come on. I got a job for you. So I sold all my stuff and packed up and went and spent a year abroad living in Australia, and visited New Zealand and spent several weeks backpacking in Southeast Asia. And I think it was in Australia where I kind of recommitted myself to getting into art. It was kind of, it was pretty informal, but I was out in the world figuring out who I am, in relation to the world. And I started journaling and doing art and kind of just, exploring who I am. And it was great traveling and visiting all the different museums. I was going to every museum I could find and just trying to soak up the different cultures. And it was a really good experience. And then after a year, my visa expired and I came back to the States, and my dad was living in Sonoma, California, and he had been recently diagnosed with leukemia. So I decided I wanted to go be close to him for as long as I could. So I moved to Sonoma, and I worked landscaping for a while, and I was working with these guys, like all Mexican crew. These guys were really hardworking. They're in their 40s, and they, after working with them for a while and hearing their story about how they came to the States, and their hopes and dreams for their kids, and they didn't have an opportunity to go to school. And I really saw that, I had to take advantage of the fact that those were things that were accessible to me. So I decided to go try again at school, give it another shot. I started going to Santa Rosa Junior College, and I spent 2 years there. I started, I don't know have you guys students, I guess, did you come here? Did you spend any time at junior colleges or junior colleges? Transfer students? All right. Yeah, it's a different path, but it's a really valuable path doing the transfer student thing. So I was at Santa Rosa Junior College. I started taking art classes because it was early. I didn't know what I really wanted to do. I knew I wanted to be back in the kind of academic, circles, but I didn't really know what I wanted to do. So started taking art classes and kind of diving into that and was into it. And then I took an architecture class, an architecture history class, and I really enjoyed it. I fell in love with the historical part of architecture, from the early original agriculture based settlement architecture to the kind of as architecture grew and cultures and civilizations grew across the world, and the kind of ebb and flow. I thought that was really interesting. So I started kind of following that path, and then I think I took two other architecture classes there, and then the chair of the department announced that she was going to step down and they were going to restructure the program there, so they kind of put it on halt. But I had already kind of committed myself to following this path at this point. So they gave me a couple different options of what I could do if I still wanted to pursue it. And the option that made the most sense was to go to San Luis Obispo, which is in Central Valley, California. And try to get into Cal Poly there because they have a really good architecture program. So I went down and visited, and it was really beautiful environment, and the campuses were both really nice. So I transferred down to the junior college there, Cuesta College. I spent another 2.5 years at Cuesta College, going through the architecture program there and with ambitions of transferring. Lots of sleepless nights and grueling, efforts at hopefully having a chance to transfer. So I audited my mom's class this morning, and I heard everybody talking about their seniors, and everybody's like tired. And it's good that we all have that in common. You guys are not alone in that. I think every college student feels that way. But the important part is just not, sticking it out and not giving it up. Just keep going no matter what. These first few slides are some of the work that I did when I was at Cuesta College, the architecture program. Cal Poly doesn't, a lot of colleges, if you're transferring, you do like a written portion and you apply and you have your written portion and you say why you want to go there. For the architecture program at Cal Poly, it's all portfolio based. And so you have to put together a portfolio that demonstrates that you've, developed an understanding of all of the aspects of architecture. So, spatial understanding, and this is a project in my first or second year. Everybody took an element. Everybody got a theme for a chamber, and they had to design something, and then it would kind of go into this big park setting, and designed an addition to the school campus. So through architecture, it's lots of plans. A lot of people are familiar with the floor plans anyways, but there's other means of architectural representation, sections, details, diagrams. So lots of diagrams, understanding the site and all the things that influence the site conditions. And then, you get into graphics, you're working on graphic design, but also 3D renderings and things of that nature, getting exposure to construction materials, and familiarizing yourself with the materials and what it actually looks like to build things in real life. And we built a shed in that class, designed a little tiny house, and just developing an understanding of architecture and spatial relationships and things like this. Lots of model making. And model making is used often in architecture to better understand the materiality and some of the practical aspects of that. We did a cool project, a lantern project, where you design a lantern and then you have to float it out onto the water, light some candles in it, and float it out into the water. So we did that in Pismo. That was a fun project. In SLO, San Luis Obispo is the city. Yes, sorry.
So
Please jump in here. Sorry, I'll just
you get a bad grade if your lantern sinks.
If your lantern sinks, oh yeah.
It's on fire.
Oh yeah, yep.
What was it made out of, the lantern?
Everybody did a little differently. I think it was all kind of paper based. So I used wooden dowels and then paper, card
So
stuff.
if you didn't make it right, it would burn up and.
Yeah, a couple of people sunk. I think a couple of people's got a little hot. I don't know if anybody's actually caught on fire and really in a grand, Viking burial kind of thing or anything. Everybody was kind of hoping for it. It's all right, who's gonna be the one who's gonna have, that's gonna happen. So thanks for that. So that was fun. No real fireworks for that one. But we had a project in SLO. San Luis Obispo is a town. SLO is the kind of acronym, and everybody just calls it SLO. They had a theater, so we designed a theater system there, and it was kind of cool and interesting to learn all about theater. I kind of was in theater growing up, so I was familiar with some of the aspects and elements and things that go into it, but definitely still learned a lot about that, and the kind of served and service spaces. That's kind of a big thing, separating the served and service spaces. They like to show and have a demonstration of your technical understanding. So like I was mentioning before, details and cross sections and things of that nature in a way that's like graphically appealing that will draw people in and make them want to like look at your stuff, look at your work and think about it a little bit more in depth. We did like a little portal project into SLO. There's an intersection there. Kind of just a fun, exciting like entry into town. And so anyways, over this time, I was kind of just building my portfolio and trying to put something together with the hopes of, one day transferring. The drawing never stopped, kept drawing, and had a lot of fun with that. And so really, the whole process was learning and dealing with all the ups and downs and ebbs and flows. Architecture, although it's like highly art influenced, it's also, math and sciences. And as I said, I wasn't really an exceptional student, so it was super challenging getting through all the math and sciences. I think I had to take calculus like 3 times. So if you're seniors, then you're kind of all probably through the hard stuff. But if you, ever had questions about, should I keep going through this? Is it worth it? It's like, find a way to get through it, no matter what. I'm left-handed, and I was going through this. I was taking an engineering class, and they were all right-handed desks, and I was struggling with the tests. And then the teacher was like, "Well, maybe you try sitting like in a left-handed desk." And I got a left-handed desk swapped out, and then I passed the test. And so it's like little things that you learn along the way that like make it easier for you to all the tools and techniques and tips and tricks that you can learn to get yourself through it one way or another. Was an important lesson that I learned. So I finished and got my associate's degree at Cal Poly in architecture, and my kind of cohort who I was with, the studio group. So when you're in architecture school, it's a lot of studio work, which is like where you're doing all the designing, and all of you're working through all of the site analysis and all the drawings and everything like that. And then you have to take your kind of supplementary classes, your science and engineering and math and all that stuff. So, but your studio groups are pretty tight knit. So when I transferred, everybody applied to Cal Poly, I was the only person in my group, in my cohort, to get accepted to Cal Poly, which was really huge for me coming from where I came from and, not necessarily being the best student historically, and the very, very low percentage of Black students in architecture. I think 2% of architects are Black across the board. So I really recognize this as like an important opportunity. And I was really excited, even though I had a little bit of like survivor's guilt, and the rest of my cohort didn't make it in with me, as like I couldn't really let that stop me or influence me too bad. So I transferred to Cal Poly, and this is a photo of my transfer group. We all were in all the transfer students were in one studio that year. They don't always do it like that. Sometimes they'll spread people out, but it was good that we all had the transfer thing in common. We could relate to that, and everybody hit it off really well. And I couldn't have asked for a better group to be with. Some of you in this room were at the talk last night, so I'm like, if you're hearing anything repeat, forgive me for that, but hopefully it's not too boring or whatever. If you have any comments or questions, just jump in here. But so I got started at Cal Poly, met all these amazing people in the group, started going through the studio design program there. The first project we did was a wine and viticulture center. So that was a fun project. We got to drink a bunch of wine that term, and visit a bunch of wineries and do lots of field research, so that was really good. Great wine in that area. And so that was fun. These are just a couple of shots of renderings that I did for the winery that I designed. Again, lots of model making and kind of understanding some of the physical constraints. It was one thing that was exciting. Oh yeah, please.
So when you're doing architecture, do you actually just do the art design of it, or do you have to take into account like where the electrical and where the lights and all that kind of stuff?
They do encourage you to think about that, like especially in your first year, you don't really have like the scope of knowledge to really include that. But as you go through by your third year, you start taking the classes that integrate all of the MEPs, and MEPs, for those who don't know, is mechanical, electrical, plumbing, all the HVAC system and all these different things. You eventually do have to learn how to incorporate these things more into the project. At this point, we did not, but there was still a lot of other physical material properties and things to think about. The sequence of making wine and how it's kind of a production line, and trying to let gravity work with the design to produce better wine was kind of a goal.
If you look on your design right there, right on the left-hand side where that hillside is, I'm just curious, your structure doesn't go into the hillside, does it? It's not like there's a cave in there.
No, it doesn't. There'd probably be some kind of ADA rail or something there. But,
And this is in the SLO PR area?
yeah, yep, it's on campus. They actually built a building there, but I think any of the designs that came out of our class would have been better than the one that actually got. If I can say so humbly.
And did you, Jordan, did you have to take into account the rocks that are there, for the foundation,
Not as much. Again, this is still kind of early on. As we kind of continued on, we did, you have to think about this thing, but they do talk about siting it and how you orient your building on the site in order to take advantage of, heating and cooling, natural heating and cooling, prevailing winds, daylighting, and things like this. And then, how that kind of ties into winemaking, and some of the practical things, like where do your delivery trucks come and pick up the material and take it out of there. So, they really start to encourage you to start thinking about these kinds of things. So the next term I worked on this project that was an urban food hub. So the first term, they give you a kind of introductory project. They give you the prompt and say, okay, we're going to do a wine and viticulture center. So here's the parameters, and go ahead and do it. One of the fun things about architecture is you can basically do anything that you want in terms of design, so long as you can present a good argument for it. So, and that kind of, in life, that's kind of a good lesson, you can do almost anything you want here if you can have a good argument for it. So they give you the first prompt, but then as you go through, they start allowing you to pick your own themes and topics. So the next term, I chose to do an urban food hub in Atlanta, to address some of the food desert situation that's out there. If you're not familiar with food deserts, classified as a location that's a mile or more from a grocery store or fresh produce or something like that. I guess it's pretty agricultural out here, right? So I don't know if there's really any food deserts in this area, but they're more common in urban areas. So I just played with this idea of vertical garden, and then there's a marketplace and some other program that's happening in here. And then the idea is that it's drone delivery. So you can, someone who is in a food desert, at least as long as they have phone access, they can use the app and order food and have it delivered to them. And Amazon, they're kind of doing this. They're kind of rolling this kind of thing out now. So it was kind of fun to see that overlap happen. Even though this is kind of a futuristic idea, it's we're actually starting to scratch the surface of this kind of thing. And the whole thing is making food more accessible, to people, healthy food, so people aren't going to, fat grocery store, or not grocery stores, but fast food or gas stations or something like that to get their nutrients. So started getting into structural stuff here, big steel and the structure, facilitating the function of the building. So the drones kind of come into these little ports and then get loaded up with the bags of groceries or whatever, and then flown out. So that was kind of a fun project. So I'm kind of, as I'm going through, they're all like service, you're thinking about communities that you can help, communities that are in need, and ways to have architecture like facilitate the needs of these groups. So the next project I did was for the smoke jumpers. At this time, I was displaced from Cal Poly, as a lot of people were. It was like the start of the COVID pandemic, and it started like early, I think maybe in February or March or something. And they kicked everybody off campus and basically said, we can't have you here for now. We'll still do everything Zoom, virtual. So that was the start of that. I'm sure you guys were all in school through that, right? You lived through that, and everybody kind of experienced that in a different way, in their own way. But for me, I was forced. I don't know. I didn't have anybody in the area really, so I had to go to Idaho, and I lived in Boise for a while. I lived in my sister's basement with her kids and dogs, and that was like a fun experience. But I just basically locked myself away countless hours in the basement in the dark, like doing these projects. But it was a good learning experience. But so I picked a site in Idaho. I have a family member who was doing smoke jumping for a while. Smoke jumping, if you're not familiar, is like firefighting service, wildfire fighting service, and they jump in planes into the fires, and they kind of mitigate and try to put out the fires from within the forest fire. So it was something that was like near and dear to me, and doing research about the topic, what I learned was that a lot of smoke jumpers are like nomadic. So they're there in one location during the season, but then they kind of get displaced and they find other things to get into in the off season. But a lot of these guys, they, struggle with mental health, and that you're so close and tight knit during the season, and then the off season, you're kind of isolated and alone. And that's hard for anybody, to go through. And at this time with the pandemic stuff going on, it really like rang true to me. So I thought this was a good thing to pursue. So this is like a competition drawing that I did with mixed media, kind of burning some cardboard and working like physical materials into like digital drawings, and kind of just conceptually playing with this kind of thing. And the idea was that there's this kind of like big lodge type space that all of the smoke jumpers could, share with their families. And there's living quarters and like a big grand stair and a big hearth and fireplace where people can kind of come together and be in community so that they don't feel isolated. But it was kind of one part of a larger area. So there's the big lodge, there's the smaller like articulated A-frames where people, if they were going to stay there for longer term, that they could be there with, one or two people if they were a couple or something. And then like my family member who is a smoke jumper, and a lot of these guys, they'll have a trailer or something on their truck. And so this was kind of a spot where they could just pull their truck and trailer up, and they could plug into the utilities and get showers and get water and get up off of the ground. And then if they wanted to leave and come and go, they could. So that was a fun project, learning all about smoke jumping and the kind of pressures and things that these guys deal with, going through that. And then when I was so this is still living in the basement time, but Cal Poly, they offer this off-campus program called LA Metro, and it's like it's this reputation for being super intense and very grueling. I thought, why not? Like, why not put myself through it? I've already been through the hellfire at this point. I'll just keep going into it deeper. So even though everybody was stuck at home, they did a virtual program. So I did the LA Metro program from home, and usually you'll go live there, you'll work part-time at an internship, and then you'll do your design studio. So you do a couple days of work, a couple days of design studio and professional practice and all that stuff. So the internship was a cool project. Both of the principal architects are Argentinian, and the woman, Georgina, her mother lives in Argentina. They designed a house for her there, so they have this beautiful brick, like high design house that they did for her there. And we were tasked with designing a pergola for them, a concrete pergola. So myself and my one other classmate who got on with that firm as well, we kind of designed this pergola relation to the house, and it was a good learning experience. It's Argentina, so they have the metric system there. So like converting to metric and doing all that was a fun experience. Taking all the calcs for the concrete that would be used and everything like that. And they actually recently built this pergola. So this is like my first built design. So it's kind of cool to say that. I don't have any photos of the actual thing, but they built it just how we designed it. It didn't change hardly anything. I think the only thing that they added after we were done is like the placement of some of the lights and things like that that are embedded into the concrete. So
Hey, Jordan, what's the pergola made out of?
concrete.
It's concrete?
Yeah, yeah.
So there's like rebar in it?
That's a good question. I would imagine there's rebar in it, yeah, especially the columns. They call them wallums. It's like kind of a wall and column. It's thin profile concrete.
There's gotta be rebar if it's gonna be like.
There's rebar for sure. That's one thing we did not get into is the rebar layout. But there has to be for sure because it's it's a lot of weight.
Okay, good.
Yeah. And at that time I didn't know anything about rebar, but once I started working, I learned about rebar in a big way. So, those gaps in the one I'm proud of because it was my first built design. So that was fun. And they really didn't change anything. So these are just kind of a couple renders and views from inside the pergola. And so in this part of the speech last night or this presentation, I kind of went into my thesis project, which I will go through. I'm not going to go through it in the same kind of way that I did last night. But, up to this point, I'm learning about all of the technical aspects of architecture. I've got a little bit of, art background that I'm working into it. Art and architecture are distinctly different. They're often lumped into the same category, but they are different. And architecture just often uses like artistic means of representing the architectural ideas. So that's kind of where the crossover is, but they are distinctly different. So yeah, we're back at school at this time when the thesis project started, and they have gradually been allowing us to pick our own prompts and our own, concepts for the projects. And, at this point, I've been through a lot of adversity from, obviously all the COVID displacement, but there was a lot of like police violence and all these other things going on in the world at the time. And these things were really affecting me and just really like affirming, who I am and who I am in the world and why it's important to represent myself this way in the world. And I really encourage anybody, students especially, but anybody really, as you're learning who you are in the world, that you just find ways to affirm yourself, and you're all kind of in different rooms, but you have to like be your authentic self and represent yourself in the best way that you can when you're doing that. When I was auditing the class this morning and everybody's talking about the different working environments they're in, and talking about advocacy, and I just couldn't help but think about like the importance of your individualism and what and what a gift that is and what a tool that is to be able to use like the specific skills and traits and everything that you've developed and continue to develop. Lifelong learning, you guys were talking about it this morning. It's just like so important to just keep growing and keep understanding and developing who you are in relationship to the world and the work that you're doing. So yeah, I got into my thesis year. I chose a topic that was relevant and also like a little interesting to navigate. I picked the 1921 race riots of Tulsa, Oklahoma. Are you guys familiar with this? Yeah, so big event that happened historically, and I was interested in exploring the ways in which like the intersectionality between the story and the architecture of the time and the Black community that was there, and kind of, spend a whole year basically exploring your topic. Lots of research in the beginning, and then you kind of develop the ideas as you go along. So, looking at all of the different systemic issues that affect the Black community, gentrification, redlining, food scarcity, all of these different kinds of things, and some of the systemic and historical issues that have been affecting the Black community for a long time. So it was really educational. I started looking into other Black artists and architects who, were interested in the same types of things, and trying to draw inspiration from them. June Jordan is an author, and she's not an architect with a hard A. She doesn't have the stamp, but she worked with architects and got a lot of like recognition for her contributions to architecture. She wrote a book. She wrote a couple books, but last night I couldn't remember the book that she wrote, but I remembered it once we left. It's called His Own Wear, and it's about a couple in New York, and they're a Black couple, and they're kind of, it doesn't start off with them as a couple. They meet, and then it's written in like Black lexicon, which was pretty unusual for the time. And they're just talking about their experience in New York, dealing with all the things that they were dealing with. And there's some architectural crossover. They talk about in the book New York and like, oh, the high rises at night. And it's like, well, why isn't, what's going on? All the people leave after the workday, and then those high rises sit empty. So they kind of flirt with the idea of turning, office buildings into housing to address some of the housing needs. So this is like a brownstone that they, in the book, kind of like redesigned conceptually. So this is kind of a section cut of the brownstone and how they redesigned it to kind of have a healthier and like freer space there. So yeah, June Jordan was a great influence and a great inspiration. She worked with Buckminster Fuller, who's a really well-known architect. If you've never read Operation Manual for Spaceship Earth, it's a really easy read. It's like short, and it's not super like wordy or verbose. It's a good, easy read, and it's really valuable. You take a lot of value from it, even if you're not in the architecture world. So they kind of work together on this concept of Skyrise for Harlem, and they played with this idea of bothing, which is like typically construction, you have an existing building, you knock it down, and then you build something else in its place. But they played with the idea of bothing, which is like building up on and above and continuing to build up from existing structures instead of knocking them down first. So she was a really good inspiration and influence. I got these kind of slides flipped around, but this was my thesis project title. And like I was saying, going into like the Tulsa race riots of Greenwood and Black Wall Street there. Other inspirational people that I looked at were Amanda Williams, Walter Hood, who actually has a firm in Oakland, which is where I live currently. Theaster Gates, he just won a prize. I think his Serpentine Pavilion is a design that he created, I think last year, that was gained like great recognition. I think it was a part of the Biennale. He was a great source of inspiration. Saku Cook, he does hip hop architecture, and I love hip hop, so it was great to like read and learn about the Blackness and the history of hip hop and the crossovers of architecture. Really fun.
Jordan?
Yeah.
What makes something hip hop architecture?
So there's probably a long explanation for that. But he uses, yeah, good question.
We'll just take it at that. Right.
Yeah. I think he uses, there's also another guy, blanking on his name right now, but he uses architecture. And they both use like the cadence, like the elements of hip hop. I think there's 5 elements of hip hop. It's like rapping, breakdancing, DJing, graffiti, and there's another one that I can't think of, but using all of the different elements of hip hop and kind of like studying the patterns and trends within those and then translating them into some kind of built environment. The other guy, Michael Ford, who does hip hop architecture, he just actually I don't know if they broke ground or how far along on they are, but they have a hip hop museum that they worked with rappers like Nas, if anybody listens to hip hop, to put that together. And his work's really cool too. He does a lot of like pattern making that he'll like take a rap song and then the kind of cadence or the like bar structure and turn that into like textile patterns. And then he's made like rugs and pillows and all kinds of cool designs, interior design patterns. So that's a way that is, hip hop's being used to get incorporated into the design world and into built and, constructed things. So let's see, how are we doing on time here? We're doing pretty good. So like I said, I'm just going to kind of skim through the thesis project, but I learned a lot about the history of this place and this space and time. And I gained a lot of knowledge and insight about what was going on in this place at this time. And I developed thesis arguments, like an argument that space has memory, even if it's not a physical, even if it's not the physical buildings, the spaces that are defined, the kind of negative space, and place has memory. Architecture has a responsibility to preserve the memory, and an obligation to tell the story of a place, and that buildings can be tools to test these kinds of ideas. So I was just kind of played with lots of modes of representation. And as I kind of was saying earlier, architecture usually uses like plans, sections, diagrams, details as a means of like conveying an idea. That's the language that is used by architects to convey an idea. But I really was hell-bent on kind of redefining that approach and using other means of representation to kind of tell the story. So I did lots of like graphic design stuff, and the buildings in this block of the neighborhood that were destroyed during the riots, there was some rubble, and the rubble was rebuilt into this little facade piece, the orange highlighted part there that exists today. They gathered those bricks and kind of rebuilt this sliver of the historic Greenwood and put it into the new neighborhood when they rebuilt it. So lots of fun just playing with lots of graphic design and doing lots of research. And to me, the Black Wall Street at that time was like the best possible location to dive in and explore these kinds of things. Referring to historical data and information about the place and time, Sanborn maps, they were used to it was like an insurance program, and they used this for fire insurance and learned like how to designate and classify spaces that were prone to fires. And one thing I didn't mention last night, but the Black community, knowing the likelihood of their places being burnt down, they actually built most of the community out of brick. So they did that like with intention. And there's brick factories like in town. Yeah, here it is right here, the brick plant. So, they did this intentionally, but unfortunately it didn't do much. They still ended up getting a lot of the community burnt down, but This young lawyer, BC Franklin, he moved to the town or the city like a few weeks prior to the events that took place. And then he later he wrote a manuscript, and his manuscript was found, and he has like firsthand accounts of the events that took place. So it was really interesting reading about his story and all that good stuff. I'm try to just get through this, but yep. Thriving neighborhood community. They had everything they needed there. It got burnt down after like an altercation. That was kind of a race-based altercation, and it blew up into this whole big scene. And just this is a drawing that I did that kind of just tried to represent the past, present, and future of this space. And if anybody's taken any engineering classes, when you do engineering, you do free body diagrams to kind of show where forces are, loads and forces are on a given thing, a bridge or a building or anything like that. So these are diagrams that kind of represent the loads and forces that were happening to the community at that time. I played around with ideas for formulas for spatial liberation and just trying to like use what I know to think about things a little bit differently in terms of how these things intersect. I did some collaging, which was a good experience. Lots of diagramming, 3D diagramming.
Can you go back
Yeah.
2 slides for me there?
Two
One
slides.
there, right there. So are you saying that you did these spatial diagrams regarding sort of buildings, or this is like a social sciences type of spatial
Yeah.
thing? Okay, so
Yeah.
social sciences. All right. Did you use like Kurt Levins or Kurt Lewins, if you pronounce it that way? Any of his when you were working on that?
I don't recognize the name. What is his?
He was a Gestalt psychologist that fled Nazi Germany, and he had these force diagrams where he would sort of try and capture different social pressures with the thickness and the distance of arrows, and then use those to predict behavior. But it sort of sounded like it might have been inspired by that, but it sounds like you were doing your own thing though.
Yeah, I did not come across him, but I'm gonna have to go back and explore what his work and see what kind of crossovers there were. Amanda Williams, who I spoke of earlier, she also, I kind of derived this from some of the work that she was doing and tried to like carry her work forward a little bit. So that was the most, having gone through the engineering courses and learning about, the free body diagrams and some of her work, that's kind of where this stuff emerged. That name sounds familiar. I'm gonna have to go back and look and see, but I don't think I had any forehand knowledge of that when I was going through that. So yeah, part of the exploration was playing with all different kinds of mediums and playing with the brick. It was very important to that story, the module of brick, and kind of conforming it and distorting it and doing some different things. And BC Franklin, his kind of like journey through the town at the time, taking that path and making it kind of a gestural play space for the community, getting into like sculpture. I tried and played with sculpture, which was an interesting experience, but I was really just trying to like get this energy and this idea out through any way that I could. This was like an approach that was like a kind of parasitic architecture that kind of sought to, like in the most literal way, reclaim space, like attach and kind of like engulf these buildings and reclaim the space and the story. So playing with lots of different means of representation. There were a couple other of Black students in my graduating class, and I thought it was important to bring them kind of into the conversation, being that it's rare to even be Black in architecture. And so we did a photo shoot over a couple of days, which was a really fun kind of study to do and just further play with the idea of the Black body in space, free from like a lot of the systemic and societal constraints that are put on the Black body as we move throughout the world. So it was really fun. Just played a pretty good playlist, and everybody just danced and moved around and had fun. And my friend Will, he was doing some breakdancing, so that was kind of like bringing hip hop architecture into it a little bit. And so yeah, it was really good, really fun experience playing with all these ideas. I think we're getting pretty close on time, so I'll try to kind of just wrap it up here. But I was telling these guys last night that in architecture you have critiques ever so often. You design for a couple weeks and then you sit down in front of a panel of architects and they just really like grill you on what you're presenting and how you're telling the story. And I had this really brutal critique where I had all of this information and I put it up and I put it in front of these people and they did not receive what I was trying to tell them at all. And they really just let me have it. And, I struggled with it at the time. And after I kind of cooled down and I stepped away, I realized that I just probably wasn't telling the story in a way that was making sense to them. So, it gave me a chance to kind of return back to some of the traditional methods of representation architecture. Like, okay, I can get to these guys somehow, if no other way, through traditional representation. So let me try it again. So I played with the ideas from the story, breaking the grid, disrupting the flow or status quo, some of these kinds of ideas that played out in the story, try to turn them into physical manifestation of that. So the concept that I delivered late in the game was a pedestrian bridge that linked two important locations in the story. The town, the neighborhood that was Black Wall Street, and the jailhouse where a lot of this tension happened in between these two spaces. So the idea was to like elevate the pedestrians in a way that elevated and freed people from the rigidity of the grid in the city. And it's painted red to kind of represent and counter the redlining, which is a common housing practice that was used. Again, back at the model making. And then I did a chunk model that kind of represented this thing. It has little cantilevered sections every so often so that you can pull off and pause and reflect about the story. And the way that these things kind of touch the ground is meant to kind of disrupt, like I was saying, the flow of traffic and the status quo of people just moving on, through their daily lives without really thinking about this. To your point about Germany, when I had the final critique or one of the final critiques, the German professor, architect, he was telling me about after the Holocaust, they put these gold bricks in the ground that had like people's names on them. And that was a way to memorialize some of the names and people that were in the Holocaust. So I kind of adopted that idea as a way to begin this initial interaction with this thing, this bridge. So the pavers in the ground that would have like people's names, and they visually kind of start to lead you into this space. And then the actual vertical circulation, the staircase, is kind of separated from the ground. So you're actually like leaving the grid and you're stepping into this thing that represents the story of this place and space. And these are kind of the two spaces and just some of the drawings that kind of represent that. So it was really good, spent a whole year doing this, studying this, producing all of these different ways of representation and trying to tell the story through these things. And I graduated at the end. I finally graduated and I had the highest GPA that I've ever had. And for me, that was huge because I was never that guy. I was never that student. I didn't think I'd ever be back in school at a certain point. So it really meant a lot to me to go through this program and go through all this stuff, finally graduate. I received an award for my thesis project and was gifted a hip hop architecture book by my thesis professor. So that meant a lot to me. And so since then, I got a job as a construction manager in the Bay Area. So I live in Oakland and I work in Berkeley, and we're just wrapping up the first project, which is an 8-story apartment building. So this whole kind of journey through the arts and through architecture and creating at different scales. And now this is like kind of the grandest thing that I've ever created, at least in terms of scale. And being able to apply all the knowledge that I've been learning in school into the real world. And using that information every day, using that knowledge every day, and also learning like tons of new stuff along the way. And I'm sure when you graduate, it'll be the same thing. Like you spent all this time in school, you've been gaining all this knowledge and understanding and wisdom, and you go out and then it's like, all right, now it's time to apply this and continue to soak in the real world constructs of whatever's happening, and continue to grow and provide, your services to the world and try to make the world a little bit better. I think that's probably what everybody's ambitions are in school for the most part anyways, or, try to make a little bit of money and live a little bit more comfortably. There's always that. Yeah. Here. So, that's my presentation. I really appreciate your guys' time and attention. I know it's like midday on a Friday, so appreciate you guys hanging in there, and just being here. So anybody has any questions or anything, I'd be happy.